The Sega Saturn was loved by many, but it also left Sega fans with a massive hole in their heart, as it simply never lived up to its 16-bit father, the Sega Genesis. What was once one of the most anticipated Sega consoles of all time quickly fell into the shadows of the Sony PlayStation. Really, there was no one to blame except Sega themselves, with massive missteps leading up to the release, along with even bigger mistakes after launch. It's hard to imagine a world where the Saturn reigned supreme. But was that ever possible? Maybe. Today on this video, we will be discussing what could have saved the Sega Saturn from being a commercial failure, making it a force to be reckoned with during a time when Sony was establishing its foothold as the king of the 5th gen. Number 1. Never creating the 32X. Sega's response to the Atari Jaguar came as a weird combobulated attachment to the Sega Genesis, giving the console 32 bits of power. Originally designed to compete with the Atari Jaguar, the 32X used the same processor that would wind up going into the Sega Saturn. The release of the 32X in November of 1994 in North America confused many consumers, as the Saturn was set to release the same month in Japan. Because of this internal conflict of interest within the Sega Corporation, consumer confidence began to dwindle. Because both consoles used the same processor, most chips were allocated to the Sega Saturn, causing a scarcity and making the 32X that much harder to get. As much as some of us love the 32X, I sometimes wonder how much more success the Saturn would have had without its existence. Number 2. SILLICON Graphics. Once upon a time, Tom Kalinske met with executives from SILLICON Graphics. SILLICON Graphics was a processor manufacturer who focused on 3D processing for computers. As the use of graphics cards became more available and cheaper, these chips became less in demand. SILLICON Graphics decided to switch gears and go to the console market. The meeting with Tom Kalinske went well. Kalinske, who wanted to use the processor in the new Sega system, which would come to be the Sega Saturn, was denied by Sega of Japan, who said it would be too costly. Kalinske told executives at SILLICON Graphics they had a good chip and they should meet with Nintendo. Nintendo loved the idea, partnered with SILLICON, and the N64 was born. Number 3. Not botching the launch date. Part of the reason of the success of the Sega Genesis was it was able to launch 2 years before the Super Nintendo. Nakayama, the head of Sega of Japan, wanted to recreate this success by beating Sony to launch. Saturn was launched the previous year in Japan and gave it a head start. The Saturn was originally set to launch in June of '95 in North America. Nakayama, the head of Sega at the time, told Kalinske to move the Saturn release launch up. Kalinske, who was against the idea, had no choice. Saturn, to everyone's surprise, launched unexpected in May of 1994. This forced Sega of America to drop retailers at launch, and with no magazines or articles getting the notice, led to a very low market penetration, as consumers were mostly unaware of the launch. One major retailer who was dropped was EB Games. Soured by the decision, decided never to carry the Sega Saturn at hundreds of its retail locations. Number 4. Lower price at launch. The E3 heard round the world. $299. Sony was entering the market with its new CD-based system, promising 3D graphics never before seen on a home console. And they were going to do it $100 cheaper than the Sega Saturn. From a technical standpoint, the Sega Saturn was a more powerful console, but in a world where gamers demanded the rise of polygon gaming, the Saturn was viewed as a weaker system. A higher price at that. The Saturn, which gave us some of the greatest sprite-based games, would have fared much better at a price point on par with Sony's new powerhouse. Number 5. A true Sonic game. The lack of a flagship Sonic game was tough to deal with. It wasn't for a lack of trying, but the fact is, due to its complicated architecture, the Saturn was a real pain in the ass to develop for. Sonic X-treme was planned as the first fully 3D Sonic the Hedgehog game, taking Sonic into a 3D era of video games, and the first original Sonic game for the Sega Saturn. However, developers ran into major problems. It's reported that the first time Nakayama saw the game, he stormed out of the office. The project was put on hold, and developers were instructed to focus on the Saturn port of Sonic 3D Blast. Sonic X-treme was finally cancelled in 1996. Sega tried to bolster new mascots such as Bug and Astal, but this was Sega, and a console without a true Sonic flagship sent fans looking for something else. Number 6. More 3D focused titles. The mid-90s was a time when 3D games on PC was really starting to take off. The gap between PC and console was widening fast, and consoles needed to do something about it. Sony, Nintendo, and even the Atari Jaguar were bolstering 3D graphics. Gamers wanted a comparable experience to that of the PC, and while the Sega Saturn could in fact do some very good polygon gaming, at the time it was touted as more of a 2D experience. It's not that these 2D titles were bad. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Some games are still admired, and not only some of the best games on the system, but best games of the era. The lack of 3D gaming led gamers, even Sega fans, to shy away from the Saturn and move to new platforms, such as Sony, who is offering a full 3D experience. Number 7. Gold standard Sega sports titles. The Sega Genesis was known for its sports games. Almost completely unrivaled by Nintendo, Sega sports titles was one major reason people choose the Genesis over the SNES. This was not the case for the Saturn, with horrible titles like NFL Quarterback Club 96 and NFL 97. A lot was left to be desired. Not all sports titles were bad. One of my favorite games of the time is Worldwide Soccer. The fact of the matter is, these sports games couldn't hold a candle to its PS1 counterpart and did not feel like the Sega gold standard of sports titles we were used to. We eventually saw ports of Madden 98 on par with the PS1 version, and the first polygonal baseball game, World Series Baseball 98. But by then, consumer confidence had waned, and most of the hardcore sports players had jumped ship to Sony. Number 8. Japanese imports to the Sega Saturn. After Tom Kalinski's resignation in 1996, Bernie Stolar was set to head up Sega of America. In 1998, he publicly stated, "The future of Sega is not the Sega Saturn," and he wanted to focus on quality over quantity. This led to many great Japanese titles to never receive North American ports. This means huge titles in Japan that made the console worth buying were never ported over. Games such as Vandal Hearts, a massive JRPG that could have competed with The Legend of Mana, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, with added levels, and made Maria a playable character, could have given Sega kids a little bit of bragging rights, along with the arcade ports to the Japanese market that never came to North America. Well guys and gals, there you have it. 8 things that could have saved the Sega Saturn from being a commercial failure. If there's anything you feel I left out, let me know in the comments section. If you liked the video, be sure to subscribe and stick around for a while. If you want to support the channel, consider becoming a member. We do member-only live streams where we go back, play, and experience these amazing great games. Well, that's it for today. Do you even Saturn days, bro? I'll see you on the next video.